afternoon, folks. Thank you for coming out to join us in paying tribute to the passengers on the Mays Landing train wreck that occurred here 142 years ago. The newest Atlantic City Rail excursion, the West Jersey and Atlantic, was in operation just 2 months on August 11, 1880. That Wednesday, upwards to 1,300 Irish Catholic travelers from St. Anne's and the neighboring parishes in the Philadelphia diocese made arrangements to charter the rail line to the Jersey Shore. As part of the largest transportation enterprise, being the Pennsylvania Railroad, the new city-to-shore line was instructed to divide this large group of 1,300 people into 2 trains. The first train being 16 passenger cars, the second train being 8 passenger cars. The excursion arrived in Atlantic City without incident at 9 a.m. that morning. Eagerly, passengers exited the trains to get their glimpse of the boardwalk and the beautiful city by the sea. Although the overcast weather conditions were less than perfect, it allowed for a pleasant stroll on the boardwalk, a visit to the Margate Elephant, which was under construction at the time, just 5 miles down, and a walk down to the Absecon Lighthouse, all of which still exists today. By the end of the afternoon, both trains were ready for the 6 p.m. departure back to Philadelphia. It had already begun to rain. The travelers returned to the station and shook off any raindrops before settling into their seats. A last call for all aboard went out as the conductor from each train inspected and secured the windows against the advancing downpour, the thunderstorm. The first train departed the station for Philadelphia at New York and Atlantic Avenues. Running slower across the Atlantic City meadows, the engineer of the second train estimated their lag distance at Pleasantville to be approximately 8 to 9 minutes, or 2 miles behind the first train. A brief stop was scheduled 17 miles away in Mays Landing to allow the Down Express from Camden come in this direction, allowing that express to pass on the tracks. On the approach to Mays Landing, the engineer of the second train prepared for the wet rails by applying the air brakes 1.5 miles prior to the stop. At the Mays Landing cut, with less than 1 mile to go, he foresaw a disaster quickly developing on the single track ahead of them. He could see the last car, he's looking this direction, he could see the last car of the first train dead ahead on the trestle bridge over the Great Egg Harbor River. Right. So the engineer sees the car, the last car on the track. All right. He blows his whistle 4 times to warn off the impending impact. With just seconds to spare, the desperate engineer threw the engine in reverse, but that wasn't sufficient time or space to avoid a rear-end collision. The famous moment was 6:41 p.m. The sounds of screeching wheels, hissing steam, and steel on steel were compounded by the screams of passengers being thrown from their seats. As the 2 forces collided over the river, in an instant, the second train plowed a furrow through the last car of the first train, splintering its rear platform to pieces and crushing the wooden passenger car. The excursion escort in the last car on the second train swiftly exited his seat and rushed from one car to the next, trying to quell the commotion. It was not until he reached the horrific scene in the front section of the train that the severity of the impact was realized. Before him was crushed and lifeless body of 20-year-old James Sweeney. After James was administered his last rites by his family pastor, he succumbed to his injuries. He would be the first passenger to lose his life that night, but he would not be the last. Building up was a dense cloud of high-pressure steam and bubbling water that gushed into the doomed car from the second steam engine, choking the air and trapping its victims. The energy from the boiler rupture had blown the door wide open, and while the windows were closed. Despite significant damage, the second train remained on the trestle bridge over the river, while the tender had uncoupled and derailed on the bank. As hundreds of passengers began to leave their respective cars to survey the damage, the extent of the emergency became clear. Over 100 people were in need of medical attention, and the closest hospital was 50 miles away. The first signs of help from the people of Mays Landing came in moments after the collision. Most households had a member employed at the cotton mill who had just arrived home from the day's work. Families were sitting down to dinner on that stormy night when the horrific sound of the two trains collided over the river broke the steady rhythm of the pelting rain. Although the number of passengers rivaled the numbers of entire Mays Landing population, there was no shortage of hospitality or care in this South Jersey community. Nearly everyone agreed to take in a family or two or three into their homes. The injured were then moved to hotels and taverns where they could be collectively cared for. In the end, sadly, there were numerous fatalities and dozens injured. If you're interested in learning the complete story, including the inquest process following the accident, Mari has authored a detailed book entitled Between the Shore and the City, A Tragedy at Mays Landing, which is available on Amazon. With that said, I would like to shift the focus over to Matt Hunsberger and Gina Fornari, who will now honor the victims of the 1880 train wreck.
Elizabeth Grace. Lavinia Grace, 16 years old. Lily Grace, 19 years old. Mary J. Green, 17 years old. Mary Henratty, 22 years old. Patrick McBride, 24 years old. Henry McCann, 26 years old. Catherine McChrystal, 4 months old. Margaret McChrystal, 20 months old. M. McChrystal, 27 years old.